The 14th century was a world balanced delicately between hardship and grace. Across the green fields of Europe, from the quiet villages of England to the sun-washed courtyards of Italy, life unfolded to the slow rhythm of the seasons. People rose with the light, labored through the day, and rested when the sky grew soft with dusk. Yet even in a time when survival often depended on the turning of the plough and the mercy of weather, there was always space for leisure, small moments of peace, of laughter, of human warmth. Leisure in this age was not an abundance of free time, but the art of pausing. It was the stillness after work, the song carried on an evening breeze, the hum of a spinning wheel beside a fire. It was the way people found beauty in their daily round, not despite the difficulty of life, but because of it. Rest was both reward and necessity, woven into the cycle of labor, prayer, and community. In towns and villages alike, the bell of the church set the rhythm of every day. Its deep tone marked not only hours of devotion, but gentle pauses between toil. Morning bells called people to wake and work, but when they rang again at noon, men and women set down their tools. They gathered to share bread, to exchange talk, to breathe. This was not leisure as modern minds imagine it. No idle luxury, no long holiday, but rather a brief reconnection with life itself. When evening came, shadows stretched across the cobblestones, and the village changed its voice. The clatter of work faded, the sound of laughter rose in its place. Families gathered by the hearth. Children played with wooden toys carved by their elders. Elders told stories of saints, of spirits, of kings and travelers. The glow of the fire gilded their faces as night deepened. Beyond the windows, the dark world was vast, but inside there was light, warmth, and the comfort of company. For most people, leisure came through community. Festivals, feast days, and local fairs were anticipated for weeks in advance. These gatherings marked both sacred and seasonal time, harvests, midsummer, or the feast of a patron saint. On such days, the strict order of work relaxed. Market squares filled with color, stalls overflowed with cloth, cheese, and sweet cakes. Musicians played shawms and fiddles. Dancers circled hand in hand, stamping their feet into the dust. For a while, the boundaries between rich and poor, master and servant, seemed to blur beneath the rhythm of a common joy. Feasting was one of the most beloved forms of leisure. Even among the humblest households, the act of sharing food was a celebration. Bread, cheese, and ale were everyday fare, but on special occasions, a wedding, a successful harvest, a religious feast, tables grew heavier with roasted meats, honey, fruits, and fragrant spices that had journeyed across continents. The aroma itself was a luxury. Eating together, laughing together, breaking bread as one, these were the moments when the world felt generous. Among the noble classes, leisure carried its own customs and display. Within castle walls, ladies and lords sought diversions of refinement. Hunting was both sport and pageant. A noble's leisure might begin before dawn, when horses stamped in the courtyard and falcons waited, hoods over their eyes. The hunt was a theater of movement and sound. The gallop of hooves, the cry of hounds, the thrill of the chase through dew-silvered woods. But beyond the spectacle, it was also a communion with the land, a ritual that joined elegance to endurance. Indoors, noble leisure took gentler forms. In the quiet of the great hall, tapestries rustled as the wind moved through narrow windows. Music echoed softly. Lutes, harps, and flutes, creating a harmony meant as much for thought as for dance. Courtiers recited poetry, Lovers exchanged verses written on scraps of vellum, and conversations drifted between philosophy and gossip. Leisure was not mere rest here. It was a cultivation of grace. And yet even among peasants and craftsmen, there was art. A blacksmith might carve a pattern into an iron hinge simply because he could. A weaver might dye her cloth in brighter colors than necessity demanded. Beauty was leisure too, the patient shaping of the world into something more than useful. People of every rank found ways to ornament their hours, to lift the ordinary into the realm of delight. Across Europe, monasteries stood as islands of calm. Within their walls, leisure took a spiritual form. Monks followed a strict rhythm of prayer and labor, but their contemplative hours were themselves a kind of rest, time given to silence, to thought, to the steady work of copying manuscripts or tending gardens. In those gardens, bees hummed, and herbs released their scents into the still air. Leisure here was not entertainment, but tranquility, the slowing of the mind until it matched the pace of the soul. For women, leisure was shaped by both duty and creativity. Many spent long hours in domestic labor, yet within those hours were small freedoms. The embroidery worked by candlelight, the songs sung while spinning wool, the stories whispered among friends. In cities, some women gathered for religious guilds or charitable groups, finding in shared devotion a pause from isolation. In courts, noble women read romances and composed their own. Leisure was not absence of work, but the claiming of moments for oneself, however brief. As the 14th century moved through its seasons, leisure followed the rhythm of nature. Spring brought May Day, when villagers carried garlands of flowers and danced around the green. Summer meant open-air feasts and long evenings by the river. Autumn's leisure was slower, touched with the satisfaction of harvest. Winter's more intimate, stories told while the wind pressed at shutters, games played on polished boards, the quiet crackle of the hearth. And always, beyond the festivities and the music, there was the simple peace of watching. A shepherd resting on a hillside, eyes half closed as clouds drifted past. A merchant leaning in his doorway, watching children chase each other across the street. A pilgrim pausing on the road to gaze at the mountains ahead. In these moments, leisure belonged to everyone, not as privilege, but as the heartbeat of being alive. As twilight deepened across medieval Europe, the world softened. The workday's rhythm gave way to slower movements. The smell of wood smoke, the hush of animals settling in their pens, the murmurs of families returning indoors. The day's labor ended and leisure began, not with a grand announcement, but with the tender fading of light. Evening was the hour when words were exchanged most freely. People spoke of the harvest, of the weather, of neighbors and kings, of births and losses. Stories stretched across the generations, binding the living to the dead. Around the hearth, the voices of elders carried wisdom disguised as tale. Listeners heard of saints who tamed wolves, lovers who crossed rivers of fire, travelers who vanished into forests of gold. These stories, half memory and half dream, were the first leisure of the imagination. They allowed the weary to travel without moving, to explore the wide world from within the comfort of their homes. In towns, the streets glowed faintly with lanterns. Taverns came alive with laughter, and the rough music of cups striking tables. Here, leisure took on a bolder face, dice clattering, songs rising in unsteady chorus, the taste of ale washing away the day's fatigue. Carpenters, bakers, and apprentices shared benches with travelers and sailors. Some came to gamble, some to forget, some simply to listen. The tavern was the common man's hall, where talk was free and joy was loud. For the more restrained, there were games of quiet skill, chess, checkers, or backgammon played on carved boards, polished by many hands. These games were as much conversation as competition. A move might lead to a proverb, a jest, or a story of some clever trickster who outwitted a noble. Leisure, in this sense, was a practice of wit and patience, a small rehearsal for the games of life itself. Music, too, was never far. It wound its way through all levels of society, a thread that joined the countryside to the court. Peasant fiddlers played simple dances learned by ear, their tunes echoing off wooden walls and open fields. Minstrels in noble halls performed chansons and ballads, tales of love, loss, and valor. Music was not mere entertainment, it was memory set to sound. Every region had its melodies, shaped by dialect and weather, and every listener carried them in the heart long after the song had ended. In certain cities, especially those rich with trade and art, leisure began to take on a more public form. In Florence, Paris, Bruges, and London, processions filled the streets on holy days. Guilds of weavers, masons, and merchants paraded beneath banners painted with their emblems, each displaying not only their craft, but their pride. The people lined the streets to watch, to cheer, to share in the spectacle. The smell of incense mingled with that of roasted nuts and spiced wine. Children perched on walls, their eyes wide with wonder. The pageant was both devotion and delight, a sacred theatre for the whole town. Beyond the walls of cities and castles stretched the quiet leisure of the countryside. For the farmer, rest came between seasons, after the sowing, before the harvest. Fields lay still beneath a mild sky, and the air was full of birds. On such days, families picnicked on the edge of meadows, sharing bread and cider, their laughter carried away by wind. Shepherds carved small flutes or whittled bits of wood into animals. These were small acts of creation, born from idleness but shaped by care. In the noble estates, gardens were places of cultivated leisure. Carefully tended beds of herbs and flowers bordered smooth lawns where ladies walked, their gowns brushing against lavender and thyme. Fountains sparkled in the sunlight, and marble benches offered shade beneath fruit trees. Here, conversation was an art. Topics wandered from poetry to theology, from the turning of the stars to the color of a friend's eyes. The garden, with its order and harmony, mirrored the ideal of leisure itself, time structured but free. Books, too, became companions for the fortunate few who could read. Monastic scribes illuminated manuscripts with careful hands, layering gold leaf upon pigment, each letter a jewel. To read was a privilege, but also a form of quiet escape. Chronicles, romances, and moral tales invited readers into worlds of wonder and reflection. In them, knights rode through forests of enchantment. Pilgrims sought wisdom on distant roads. Dreamers conversed with angels. The act of reading was a private leisure, a dialogue between the mind and the unseen. Not all leisure required words or company. Some found peace simply in the act of watching, the play of sunlight through trees, the slow movement of clouds across the sky, the ripple of water in a trough. In these moments, time itself seemed to loosen. The harsh edges of duty softened, and the soul rested. Even in an age when labor was constant and mortality near, people learned the ancient comfort of looking, of being still. Leisure also carried a moral weight in the 14th century. The Church taught that idleness could invite sin, yet it also allowed, even encouraged, time for contemplation. True leisure, it said, was not wasteful, but restorative. It was time turned toward goodness. A walk through the fields could become prayer. A song could honor the Creator as easily as a psalm. The rhythm of rest was sacred, an echo of the seventh day when all creation paused. And so the people of the 14th century lived within a landscape of pauses. Their leisure was simple but profound, a market day filled with noise and color, a stolen nap in the shade of an apple tree, a dance at the edge of a harvest fire, a whispered conversation beside a sleeping child. They did not measure time in hours of productivity, but in the pulse of light and dark, of season and silence. The idea of leisure as joy in stillness shaped how they experienced the world. To rest was to remember one's place in it, not apart from labor, but woven through it. Life was hard, yes, but it was also deeply textured. Every sound, every scent, every moment of laughter was a thread in the great fabric of being. The people of that time, whether they knew it or not, had mastered the art of living within rhythm rather than against it. As the moon rose over the rooftops, a hush settled once more. Dogs barked distantly, an owl called from a tower, the wind whispered through reeds. In that darkness, so full of quiet life, each household drifted toward sleep. The fires dimmed, voices faded, and the world turned again, ready for another day of work and another night of rest. Leisure was the bridge between them, the soft breath between effort and dream. With the dawn, the world stirred once more, but not everyone rushed to work. Some mornings in the 14th century began quietly, with the pale light spilling through shutters and the sound of bells rolling across misty fields. Before the day's tasks resumed, there was a stillness that people cherished. The slow moments of waking, a shared loaf, a whispered prayer, the soft creak of wood as the house came alive, were themselves a form of leisure, a pause between sleep and duty. Leisure was not only found after labor, but within it. The rhythm of manual work often allowed the mind to wander. A woman weaving cloth might hum a tune passed down by her mother. A ploughman might sing to his oxen, his voice carrying across the field. These small songs filled the air like threads of comfort, blending effort with ease. The hands worked, but the spirit drifted. For those who traveled, leisure took on another form entirely. The 14th century was an age of movement. Merchants along the trade routes, pilgrims walking to holy shrines, scholars journeying between universities. Travel was hard, but in its pauses there was beauty. Roads wound through valleys of wildflowers, over bridges where rivers glinted like glass. Inns offered warmth, conversation, and news from distant lands. In the evening, travelers sat together by the fire, sharing stories of where they had been and where they hoped to go. The road itself became a teacher in patience and wonder. The sea, too, was a landscape of leisure for those who lived along its edge. Fishermen mended their nets in the quiet after dawn, watching the tide breathe in and out. Children gathered shells or chased gulls. Old men sat and told tales of ships that never returned. The sea offered no luxury, yet it brought a deep calm, a reminder of the vastness beyond daily life. Its rhythm, endless and certain, mirrored the rhythm of rest that all people sought. In monasteries and convents, the hours were marked by prayer, but within that structure lay peace. The monks who tended vineyards, baked bread, or illuminated texts found their leisure in devotion. Their world was measured not by wealth or accomplishment, but by attention, each letter shaped with care, each vine pruned with patience. Silence itself became a companion. For them, Leisure was not escape from life, but entry into it more deeply, a way of listening to the still voice beneath all motion. Among the growing towns of Europe, guilds brought new kinds of leisure. Craftsmen who worked together by day often celebrated together by night. Feast days for the guild were full of ceremony. Processions with bright banners, banquets lit by hundreds of candles, songs written for the occasion. These gatherings were part labor, part pleasure. They strengthened pride in work while reminding all that joy was a shared creation. The nobility, ever conscious of grace, found leisure in refinement. They read aloud from romances that told of knights and courtly love, stories of devotion and destiny. Music filled their halls, not the raucous songs of taverns, but measured melodies played on harp and viol. The women embroidered silken scenes, while men composed verses or practiced falconry in the fields. Such pastimes were meant to shape character as much as to delight the senses. Beauty was a discipline, and leisure a lesson in composure. Yet even in those grand settings, the heart of leisure was the same as in any cottage, a longing for harmony. Whether through prayer, art, laughter, or the quiet observation of nature, people sought the same still center. The 14th century knew storms of war and waves of plague, yet the instinct to rest, to find moments of peace, endured. It was how people reminded themselves that they were more than their suffering, that life still offered sweetness even amid uncertainty. In the countryside after the harvest, a gentle idleness returned to the land. Fields lay bare, but breathing. Villagers walked among the stubble, gathering what was left, stray grains, fallen fruit, a final handful of herbs. Children ran ahead, chasing each other through the fading light. At dusk, smoke rose again from cottages, and laughter carried through the cool air. The year had completed its circle, and for a little while, time seemed to slow. Such was leisure in the 14th century, humble, rhythmic, deeply human. It was not measured by how long it lasted, but by how fully it was felt. A sip of warmth from a shared cup, a song sung into the wind, a pause beneath the stars before returning indoors. These moments, fragile and brief, gave shape to life. They taught patience, gratitude, and the quiet courage to begin again when morning came. Winter brought with it a different kind of leisure. The cold pressed close against walls and windows, urging people inward. In towns and villages, life folded itself around the hearth. The crackle of burning logs filled the silence, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and spice. Work slowed, but companionship flourished. There was more time to mend tools, to sew, to talk, to listen. Rest was not idleness. It was the body's way of matching the pace of the season. In many homes, the long nights were made warm with storytelling. Each tale was a vessel for memory, carrying the voices of those long gone. There were legends of miraculous healings, of brave deeds, of wanderers who met angels on dusty roads. Some tales were gentle lessons, others were pure fancy. The listeners did not care which were true. Truth was not the point. What mattered was the rhythm of the voice, the comfort of words wrapping around the room like a soft blanket. Children often played simple games indoors, tossing pebbles, balancing sticks, or guessing riddles. Adults watched with quiet smiles, their minds eased for a while. Leisure had no great ambition. It asked for no more than presence. In a world so often harsh, such small joys were acts of defiance, proof that laughter could survive any winter. Outdoors, life continued, even in frost. Ice formed on ponds, and children learned the delight of sliding across its surface. Hunters followed tracks through snow their breath rising in pale clouds. In the cities, markets stayed alive with noise and color. Hot wines steamed in cups, merchants sold wool cloaks, and minstrels sang to draw a crowd. Leisure could thrive even in the cold if there were voices to share it. For the wealthy, winter leisure took on more ceremony. Great halls glowed with torches. Guests arrived wrapped in furs, bringing gifts of fruit preserved in honey, nuts, and candied ginger. Feasts stretched long into the night. Roasted meats, spiced pies, and jugs of ale set before all. Between courses came music, games, and poetry, recited by firelight. The nobility took pleasure in elegance, but beneath the surface was the same impulse found everywhere else, the wish to feel alive, to mark the passage of dark months with warmth and community. Beyond the walls of castles and cities, monasteries glimmered faintly in the distance, their candles glowing like quiet stars. Inside, monks moved through their ordered lives, but winter brought them closer too. After prayers, they gathered in the scriptorium, copying texts while snow fell outside. The scratching of quills was a kind of music, a rhythm of focus and peace. To them, leisure was not rest from purpose, but the fulfillment of it. The act of writing, slow and deliberate, was as calming as sleep. When spring returned, leisure spilled back into the open air. The thaw released rivers and roads, and people filled them again. Markets reopened in full bloom. The scent of baking bread drifted through the streets, and musicians took to the squares, their tunes bright with relief. Young men and women celebrated May Day with dances and wreaths of flowers. After months of quiet confinement, the world felt new, and every movement was an expression of gratitude. Across Europe, the calendar of leisure followed the year's natural rhythm. Solemnity in winter, renewal in spring, abundance in summer, and reflection in autumn. These cycles shaped not only work and worship, but imagination itself. Time was not a thing to be conquered, but a circle to be walked again and again. Leisure existed within that circle, teaching patience and acceptance. Even in the greatest cities, amid the clang of hammers and the bustle of trade, moments of rest persisted. A baker paused to wipe flour from his brow and smile at the morning sun. A mason stood back to admire the curve of a cathedral arch. A scribe closed his eyes after finishing a line, hearing only the distant toll of bells. In every gesture, there was a quiet dignity, the human wish to notice the world before it passed. The people of the 14th century did not see leisure as separate from life. It was interwoven with their sense of order, faith, and beauty. It reminded them that every soul, no matter how burdened, had a right to stillness. Whether found in prayer, music, or the warmth of a shared cup, leisure was a mirror of contentment, the gentle art of being at peace within the moment one inhabited. As the century deepened, life across Europe changed in ways both quiet and profound. Trade routes lengthened, new cities flourished, and ideas moved more swiftly than before. Yet amid all this motion, leisure remained the thread that held daily life together. It was the one rhythm that did not depend on fortune or fame. Whether in the grandeur of a castle or the humblest cottage, people sought the same comfort, the chance to rest, to remember, to feel human. Many found such rest in faith. The great cathedrals that rose across the continent were not only houses of worship, but also spaces of contemplation. To walk through them was to step into another kind of time, one measured by light rather than hours. Colored glass turned sunlight into rivers of blue and gold that washed over stone floors. The hum of prayer echoed softly through the arches. Here, leisure became reverence. People entered burdened by work and left lighter, soothed by silence. For those who could read, the written word offered its own kind of escape. Books were precious, rare, and often shared among families or friends. A few pages might be read aloud each evening. The listeners gathered close, hearing stories of saints, travelers, and dreamers. Words carried them beyond their walls, into imagined gardens and far-off kingdoms. To listen was to travel without leaving home, a journey made not by foot, but by thought. Artists, too, found leisure in their craft. Painters, sculptors, and builders transformed rest into creation. To carve a figure from stone or lay color upon a wooden panel was an act of devotion, but also of joy. Leisure and labor became one when the hand worked with love. Many of the artworks that survive from that time were born in these moments of quiet dedication, hours stolen from toil to make something beautiful for its own sake. In towns, leisure took on a more social character. The public bathhouses that appeared across Europe were not only places for cleanliness, but for conversation. People met there to soak away the dust of the day, to talk, to laugh. Steam rose and echoed against tiled walls, mingling with gossip and song. For a few coins, a weary traveler could bathe beside a merchant or scholar, each equal in the simple comfort of warm water. Festivals, ever the heart of communal joy, continued to mark the seasons. Some celebrated the saints, others honored the land itself. There were harvest fairs with contests of strength, archery, and dancing that lasted long into the night. There were mock plays performed in the streets, their humor broad but their message kind. During such times, people let go of rank and routine. The cobbler might jest with the mayor. The farmer might dance with a lady. The world turned briefly upside down, and laughter became the language of equality. Leisure also shaped how people saw nature. In gardens, orchards, and forests, they felt both small and connected. The cycle of growth and decay, the return of green after frost, these were not abstractions, but daily experiences. Leisure allowed them to observe it closely, to take pleasure in it. A monk tending his herbs, a shepherd listening to his flock, a child lying in grass watching the clouds, all practiced, without knowing, a kind of meditation. Even hardship carried its own spaces of calm. During years of sickness or fear, when the world seemed uncertain, people turned to small rituals for comfort: the lighting of a candle, the singing of a hymn, the simple act of holding another's hand. Leisure could exist even in sorrow, as the breath between one moment and the next. It was a reminder that life continued, that stillness was not defeat, but renewal. Throughout the 14th century, the sense of community remained strong. No one rested entirely alone. To share food, to share music, to share silence, these were all forms of leisure. The idea of solitude as pleasure was rare. Companionship was the deeper comfort. Even in monastic life, where silence reigned, that silence was shared. Leisure was collective, woven of many lives turning together like the seasons themselves. As night returned each day, Europe quieted again. Fires burned low, and stars appeared like scattered seeds across the sky. Somewhere, a mother hummed her child to sleep. Somewhere else, a group of travelers sat beneath the same heavens, their talk fading into laughter. Across all these distances, the same desire moved: to rest, to dream, to feel the gentle weight of peace before dawn's summons. Leisure in the 14th century was not merely the absence of work, it was the presence of soul. It was the moment when time itself seemed to breathe, when people, no matter how poor or powerful, rediscovered their shared humanity in the beauty of a quiet hour. As the stars faded and the first light of morning crept across the hills, Europe awoke again to its endless rhythm of work and rest. The cycle was as steady as breath, ancient and familiar. Yet within that repetition lay an infinite variety of quiet joys. Each region had its own expression of leisure, shaped by its land, its faith, and its customs. In the north, where the days were long in summer and brief in winter, leisure followed the sun. During the bright months, people spent evenings outdoors, savoring the lingering light. They fished in clear rivers, gathered berries, and sat before their cottages, watching the fields turn gold. In the long winters, leisure moved inward again, stories told by firelight, hands busy with craftwork while snow whispered against the walls. The alternation of light and dark became its own kind of music, a balance between effort and peace. In the warmer south, leisure was bound to the rhythm of the afternoon. The heat drove people indoors, and the hours between noon and evening were slow and quiet. Families rested in shaded courtyards, children dozed, and merchants closed their shops. The air itself seemed to sleep. When the sun softened, the towns awoke once more. Streets filled with voices, with the smell of bread and oil, with songs that drifted through open windows. Leisure was not escape from life. It was a measured dance with the elements, a way of living in harmony with the day. In the East, where Europe touched the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, leisure bore traces of older traditions. Music and poetry flourished there, refined through centuries of art. In the courts of Sicily or the cities of the Adriatic, people gathered to listen to tales of love, fate, and divine mystery. The mingling of languages and beliefs gave leisure a flavor of curiosity, a sense that rest was also learning. To sit and listen was a privilege, and silence was as valuable as speech. Across the continent, the connection between leisure and art deepened. Painters captured moments of calm, the Virgin reading, shepherds resting, angels pausing in their flight. Sculptors shaped faces that seemed to dream even in stone. These works were not made for haste. They required patience, contemplation, and the slow, careful attention that only leisure allows. Through them, the people of the 14th century left behind their understanding of stillness, that beauty, like peace, cannot be forced. In rural villages, the sound of leisure was often the sound of instruments made by hand. A pipe carved from elder wood, a drum stretched with goat hide, a fiddle strung with horsehair. These humble tools carried the same spirit as the grand organs of cathedrals. Both were voices of rest. When a tune began, feet tapped, faces softened, and the weight of the world lifted. For a moment, everyone belonged to the same rhythm. Leisure also expressed itself through kindness. Acts of generosity, small and large, were common ways to mark free time. A loaf given to a neighbor, a visit to the sick, a shared candle on a dark night. These gestures transformed rest into grace. People understood that peace was greater when it was shared. The simplest gift could turn an ordinary evening into something remembered. Even the landscape itself seemed to encourage stillness. The rolling meadows, the quiet forests, the long stretches of sea and sky, all invited reflection. To walk without hurry, to feel wind on one's face, to hear nothing but the steady pulse of nature, was to rediscover balance. The world of the 14th century moved slowly enough that such moments could still be found. Leisure was not rare. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. And yet this age was not free from sorrow. The century witnessed famine, war, and the shadow of the plague. But even amid suffering, people clung to their rituals of rest. When fear passed through a village and homes stood empty, survivors still gathered to pray, to eat, to remember. Leisure became an act of endurance, a way of affirming life when death seemed too near. A shared song after morning, a simple meal among friends, a walk beneath a sky that continued to shine. These were quiet victories. In every part of Europe, from the northern fjords to the southern seas, leisure was both fragile and eternal. It existed in the smallest acts, the turning of a page, the tying of a garland, the closing of eyes at the end of a long day. It lived not in luxury, but in awareness, the knowledge that each breath, each sound, each moment of light was a gift. The people of that time did not own leisure. They belonged to it, as naturally as they belonged to the land. And when the day ended, when the bells tolled once more across fields and towns, a hush descended. Fires glowed through windows, then dimmed. Voices softened into sleep. When the morning mist lifted from the valleys, Europe shimmered with quiet purpose once more. The 14th century did not know haste as we do. Time unfolded patiently, like the unfurling of a scroll. Within that patience, leisure found its home. It was not a reward for success, but a rhythm of being, a reminder that life itself could be savored in small, deliberate ways. Among farmers and craftsmen, the day's pace allowed for conversation. As men mended fences or women baked bread, they exchanged bits of song and laughter. Words were tools as much as the hammer and the knife, shaping the air with fellowship. To speak kindly, to share a story, to pause a moment before returning to work. These were quiet forms of leisure, unmeasured but deeply felt. Children, ever untouched by the weight of duty, lived closest to leisure's heart. They played with hoops and sticks, tossed balls of rags, and built little worlds of imagination from stones and straw. Their laughter was the sound of freedom, echoing through narrow lanes and across green hills. Even the weary adults smiled at it, remembering for an instant the sweetness of being young. In towns, leisure also lived in the streets. Markets were places not only of trade, but of talk. Friends met beneath the stalls' colorful canopies, exchanging news, jokes, and the gossip of the day. Musicians played for coins, jugglers performed for applause, and fortune-tellers promised glimpses of fate. Each marketplace was a small theater of humanity where daily cares were lightened by the pleasure of company. The educated and the devout often found leisure in contemplation. Scholars in candlelit chambers bent over books, copying lines of philosophy or theology. Their work was steady and long, yet it carried a tranquility that bordered on devotion. To think was a form of rest, a turning inward toward the infinite. Likewise, for mystics and visionaries, leisure meant withdrawal from the noise of the world, to listen for the stillness within. In every monastery and convent, leisure remained disciplined. Gardens were tended not merely for sustenance, but for beauty and calm. Paths wound between rows of herbs and lilies, bees moved from blossom to blossom. A monk walking there might feel the nearness of eternity in the hum of wings, in the perfume of mint and rose. To the religious mind, this serenity was not distraction, but a form of prayer, an echo of the peace promised beyond time. The relationship between work and leisure was rarely one of opposition. Instead, each gave meaning to the other. The blacksmith rested by shaping a delicate hinge after forging heavy iron. The baker found joy in braiding dough for a festival loaf. Beauty was born from leisure because leisure allowed care, the slow attention that transforms craft into art. As summer ripened, leisure spilled once again into fields and rivers. Children swam in shallow streams. Families gathered beneath trees heavy with fruit. In vineyards, workers paused to taste a grape before the harvest, their fingers sticky with sweetness. Time seemed to slow in the heat, stretching into long afternoons where even silence had a melody. For travelers, leisure meant discovery. A pilgrim resting beside a roadside shrine might watch a procession of clouds, feeling no urge to move. A merchant waiting for a ship might find comfort in the rhythm of the tide. Even in uncertainty, there was the pleasure of seeing, of being a small part of a vast, living world. In the heart of cities, new forms of leisure appeared as trade and art grew together. Painters' guilds held exhibitions, poets recited verses in open squares. Public fountains became gathering places where people met not out of necessity, but for the joy of conversation. Though the term did not yet exist, culture itself was leisure, the desire to create and to share beauty simply for the delight it brought. As the 14th century moved toward its close, much had changed. New tools, new roads, new thoughts, but the essence of rest remained the same. People still turned toward one another at day's end, still sought the comfort of firelight and familiar voices. The same moon that watched over emperors and peasants alike shone down on a continent at peace with itself for a few brief hours each night. And as sleep came, soft and slow, the world grew silent again. The clamor of day faded, replaced by the hush that belonged to no one and everyone. In that silence lay the truest leisure, the surrender of effort, the acceptance of stillness, the dream that tomorrow would bring both labor and laughter once more. The turning of the seasons was the quiet heartbeat of the 14th century, and leisure followed that rhythm like a faithful shadow. In spring, when frost loosened its hold, fields came alive again. Men and women planted grain and herbs, their laughter mingling with the calls of birds returning from the south. Work and joy blended. The earth's renewal was leisure in motion. After planting, there was time to breathe. Villagers gathered near wells or under budding trees to share news and songs. The festivals of May brought garlands, ribbons, and bright laughter. People crowned one another with flowers, danced in circles, and sang of love and luck. These moments, ephemeral and fragrant, carried a deep sweetness, the sense that time itself could bloom. As days grew longer, travelers moved more freely across the land. Minstrels and traders brought stories from distant places, of kingdoms rising and falling, of strange foods, of miracles whispered along roads. Listening to such tales was a beloved form of leisure. In an age when most never journeyed far from home, imagination became the greatest vehicle. To hear of the world beyond was to taste wonder, safely from one's own hearth. Summer ripened into its golden fullness. The air shimmered above wheat fields, bees hummed lazily, and rivers shone like liquid glass. Leisure took on a slower pulse. Shaded naps at noon, meals eaten outdoors, the murmur of talk as twilight stretched endlessly across the sky. It was a time when nature herself seemed to rest, and people followed her example. For nobles and knights, summer also brought tournaments and hunts. Though bound in ceremony and pride, these events were not only displays of skill, but of shared delight. Families gathered to watch banners flutter, to cheer the riders, to feast afterward beneath canopies of silk. The thrill of contest gave way to laughter once the helmets were removed. In the soft dusk, songs replaced trumpets, and victory mattered less than camaraderie. The arrival of autumn changed the tone again. Fields filled with the rhythm of harvest, the steady rustle of grain, the scent of ripe apples, the joy of full baskets. Yet even here, leisure waited between the labors. In the evenings after work, families celebrated with cider and bread, their hands still dusty with earth. Gratitude was the heart of autumn leisure, the humble satisfaction of survival, the awareness that rest had been earned. Winter brought stillness, and in stillness, reflection. With the land asleep beneath frost, life turned inward. People mended, wrote, prayed, and dreamed. Fires became companions, and silence grew rich with meaning. In many homes, this was the season of storytelling. Long nights where old legends were retold and new ones born. Leisure here was intimate, domestic, lit by candlelight and memory. Across monasteries and manors alike, the year unfolded as a circle of work, softened by rest. Leisure was the breath between harvests, the pause between prayers. It was not something one sought, but something that came naturally, like dusk following day. In the changing light of each season, Europe found not just comfort, but identity. The rhythm of leisure reminded people that they belonged to the same cycle. Peasants and lords, monks and merchants, each tied to the same sun, the same moon, the same passage of time. It was a unifying stillness, as ancient as the soil beneath their feet. And when the final leaves fell, and the first snow drifted through the air, all the continent seemed to exhale. The old year faded like smoke. A new one waited just beyond the horizon. In that breath of waiting, neither work nor rest, neither ending nor beginning, lay the purest leisure of all, the space to simply be, suspended between what was and what would come. As another year passed across the lands of Europe, leisure remained the quiet thread binding generations together. It was the part of life untouched by change, older than kingdoms, older than language itself. Whether in the hum of a tavern or the hush of a chapel, leisure carried the same essence. Time softened by gratitude. In the countryside, winter leisure often turned to craft. Women spun wool beside the hearth, the fibers catching the glow of the fire. Men carved tools or shaped small toys for their children. The rhythm of hand and material became its own meditation. There was no hurry, only patience, the simple pleasure of watching something take form beneath one's fingers. Music filled these evenings too. Fiddles, flutes, and voices intertwined beneath low rafters. Songs handed down for centuries, mixed with new ones, made that very night. Each melody told a story of love, of the harvest, of hope that spring would come again. In those moments, the cold outside seemed far away. The walls of a cottage, humble though they were, could hold the warmth of a kingdom. In cities, leisure took on new forms as the late Middle Ages unfolded. Coffee was unknown, but spiced wine and ale made their way into gatherings that lasted long after dark. Merchants and scholars met in guild halls to share talk of trade, learning, or art. The hum of conversation echoed off timbered ceilings, and candles dripped slowly in their holders. Here, leisure meant not silence, but curiosity, the pleasure of exchanging ideas. Public spaces were also evolving. Squares and marketplaces began to host performances that blended devotion with delight. Moral plays, acted by local craftsmen, processions of saints' days, and dances that blurred the line between sacred and joyful. For many, these events were the highlight of the year, the proof that leisure could unite a community as powerfully as work or faith. The nobility, too, found new ways to rest. Gardens became more elaborate, shaped into patterns of symmetry and grace. They were meant for walking, for reflection, for quiet conversation. Within their hedged walls, time seemed to pause. A noblewoman reading beneath an arbor, a knight listening to the murmur of a fountain. Both were practicing the same art of stillness that peasants found by their fires. Leisure was the one luxury shared across all ranks. Travel for pleasure began, faintly, to appear. Pilgrimages still carried the spirit of devotion, yet more travelers now sought beauty along the way, a valley praised by poets, a city renowned for its church or its bridge. The journey itself became a form of rest, a way of leaving behind the known to rediscover wonder. On dusty roads lined with olive trees or heather, leisure walked quietly beside them. The 14th century also left its mark through the rediscovery of thought. In monastic libraries and early universities, scholars began to read the works of the ancients again. Aristotle, Ovid, Virgil, their words stirred minds that had long slept under the weight of repetition. To read and ponder was leisure at its purest, the joy of thinking, of seeing the world newly through an old lens. But for most people, leisure remained in the familiar, the warmth of home, the turning of seasons, the fellowship of neighbors, a shared loaf, a shared silence, a shared song. These were treasures no king could buy. Even as wars raged and plagues swept the land, the human need for peace endured. Between hardship and hope, leisure was the bridge that carried the spirit across. And so the 14th century drew slowly toward its close. Europe had known suffering, yet it had also known beauty, a beauty found not in monuments alone, but in the daily grace of living. When people paused from labor and lifted their eyes to the horizon, they felt it, the vastness of the world, the smallness of their worries, the comfort of belonging to something greater than themselves. In that awareness, leisure became almost sacred. It was not an escape, but a returning to balance, to breath, to the quiet truth that joy is born in stillness. The century's great cathedrals may have reached toward heaven, but its humble moments of leisure carried heaven down to earth. Night falls once more upon the 14th century, soft and deep. The village is quiet. The last embers of hearths glow low, and the wind moves gently through the trees. It carries with it the scent of earth and wood smoke, and the faint echo of laughter fading into dreams. In this stillness, we glimpse the truest shape of leisure, the peace that gathers after all voices have grown silent. The people of that distant age did not measure leisure in hours or possessions. It was felt, not counted. It lived in pauses, between the strokes of a hammer, between the tolls of a bell, between a mother's lullaby and a child's sigh of sleep. Leisure was the breath of the world itself, a rhythm older than labor, older even than language. Each region of Europe carried it differently. In the mountains, it was found in solitude, where shepherds watched the stars over snow-lit slopes. In the valleys, it was shared around tables, in the warmth of food and company. Along the coasts, it was the murmur of waves against the harbor wall, the promise of journeys to come. Everywhere, it spoke the same wordless truth, that rest was not idleness, but belonging. Faith, too, held leisure close. When a monk paused from his writing to gaze at a candle's flame, when a pilgrim knelt by the roadside to pray, they were not merely stopping, they were entering a deeper current of time. Leisure was the gateway to contemplation, the doorway through which the ordinary world opened into eternity. Art preserved these moments, capturing the quiet grace of the age. Frescoes of angels at play, carvings of figures in gentle repose, illuminated pages filled with winding vines and golden light, all were born from the patience of leisure. In each brushstroke and chisel mark, there lingered the calm of the hand that made it, the devotion of one who had learned to move slowly enough to see beauty. Even those who left no art behind practiced the same serenity. The farmer watching clouds above his field, the weaver humming as she worked, the lovers walking beside the river. They lived their leisure as naturally as breathing. It needed no grand expression. The simplicity was the grace. And when darkness deepened, when the world withdrew into rest, dreams carried leisure into the realm beyond thought. There, people met again in meadows that never faded, beneath skies unstained by worry. In sleep, the soul remembered what waking life often forgot, that to be alive is itself a form of peace. Centuries have passed since those evenings of firelight and song. The world has changed beyond what they could imagine. Our cities glow with endless light. Our days rush forward with noise and motion. Yet the same yearning endures within us. To pause, to breathe, to feel the slow pulse of time unhurried. The leisure they knew still lives in us, waiting beneath the surface of every day. It waits in the hush before dawn, in the long shadow of evening, in the quiet between two thoughts. It waits when we listen to rain, when we walk without a destination, when we watch the wind move through the leaves. The lesson of the 14th century is not lost, that leisure is not luxury, but necessity, the mirror in which life truly sees itself. So let us remember them, the farmers and monks, the poets and children, the nameless millions who rested beneath the same stars we see now. Their world was smaller, their days harder, yet their hearts knew the same rhythm that guides ours still. Work and rest, toil and joy, sorrow and song, each turning endlessly into the other. The fire burns low, the last candle flickers, the night holds the earth in its gentle arms. Across 7 centuries, we can almost hear the same sigh of contentment rising from the quiet fields of Europe. The 14th century drifts into sleep, carrying with it the tender wisdom of leisure, that in stillness the soul remembers its home. And somewhere in that endless night, the first bird stirs. Dawn approaches, as it always does. The world breathes in. The circle begins again.